Cities in lockdown, shops and businesses closed, and millions banned from travelling. Just what price is China paying for the coronavirus outbreak? And what will the impact be on the global economy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Halima Yadin. China is trying to contain a worsening outbreak of a fatal flu-like virus. New cases are being reported every day and the death toll is rising. The coronavirus is also having a serious impact on business. This time of year is usually the busiest in China as millions enjoy the Lunar New Year holiday. But more than 50 million people are in lockdown in a dozen cities, including Wuhan, where the outbreak began. The government has banned citizens from joining overseas tour groups to stop the virus spreading abroad. But it already has, with a number of countries reporting confirmed cases. It's the latest challenge for China, the world's second largest economy, which was already struggling with slow growth and a trade war with the United States. Neighbouring countries are particularly worried, as Rob McBride reports from Seoul in South Korea.
As China reels from the impact of the virus, some of the worst predictions suggest that economic growth could slow by as much as 4 percentage points in this first quarter. Transport connections have been brought to a standstill. Theme parks and cinemas are closed, with hotels, restaurants and stores all taking big losses. For neighbouring Hong Kong, already in recession after months of anti-government protests, the virus has delivered what might be described as the perfect economic storm. The gloom has been reflected in stock markets reopening after the Lunar New Year break. In South Korea, ministers held an emergency meeting to discuss not only the health implications of the virus, but its impact on the economic health of the country.
The government will make all-out efforts to safeguard citizen safety and minimise impact on the economy as long as this new infection poses a threat.
Comparisons have been made with the SARS virus in 2003 that had far-reaching economic impact beyond China. The difference between then and now is the size of the Chinese economy and its relationship with the global economy. More trade, more travel. China is so much more interconnected with the rest of the world that 17 years on, damage to its economy is so much more consequential. And today, the world economy is more vulnerable, facing a global downturn, as it did in 2003.
Generally, global economy was very bad, and that has affected Korea, that has affected also China. Now the situation is a little similar in the sense that, global economies tend to come down after a boom in 2017 to 2018.
What's different, it seems, is the way China has learned from past epidemics.
Scientifically, institutionally, I think China is more prepared to control this kind of epidemic.
China's success, or otherwise, will have far-reaching economic consequences for all its neighbours. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Beijing, we have Einar Tangen, investment banker and political analyst. In Singapore, via Skype, Rajiv Biswas, the Asia-Pacific chief economist for the risk consultancy IHS Markit. And in London, Gareth Leather, a senior economist specialising in emerging markets at Capital Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. We have, of course, been discussing in great depth the human impact of this virus. But if we could focus on the economic impact as well. Einar Tangen, to you first. Just how much of a crisis would you say this is in economic terms?
Well, the only thing we have to go on is really to go back to 2003 and the SARS epidemic. Now, what happened there is that it was off about 1% of Chinese GDP during the second quarter. But by the end of the year, it had actually kind of nullified. What you had in 2002 was 9% growth. In 2003, it was 10%. In 2004, 10%. Then it went up to 2011 and 2005. So there wasn't much of a big blip as people thought. Now, remember, that was a 6-month extension of this kind of outbreak. And it's anticipated that this will be about half that. So looking at those numbers, it probably will not be as discernible in terms of world GDP, although there will definitely be winners and losers.
Rajiv Biswas, if I could come to you, do you share that analysis? Do you think this is looking like a small blip in economic terms?
I think at the moment it's very early because we have to remember that this epidemic really only started at the very beginning of this year, so it's less than a month, and it's escalated dramatically in the last week. A week ago, there were about 200 cases reported in China. Today, the number of cases has soared to 4,500, and there have been over 100 deaths. So I think it's too early to say how long will be the duration of this. Certainly, if we do look at the SARS episode back in 2003, they were able to contain it. So I think what's critical now is to what extent containment is possible in a relatively short time frame. If it's not possible to contain it quickly, then of course the economic impact on China itself will escalate, and the transmission effects to the economies of other countries in Asia and elsewhere is also difficult to assess right now. It could also be quite significant.
Okay, we'll broaden out the focus shortly, but first, Gareth Leather, if I could stay with you, what's your initial analysis of the scale of economic crisis we could be facing with this virus? Because it is quite early days, is it not?
Yeah, it is early days, and I think very much it's going to depend on how long it takes for the authorities to get things under control. But the measures that they've announced already, such as, kind of closing off whole cities in central China, cancelling celebrations for Chinese New Year, they're going to have quite a sizable economic impact. And it's important to note as well that it's not just in China that's going to be affected, that the decision basically to clamp down on Chinese tourists going abroad is going to have quite a big impact on the rest of the region as well. So places such as Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore, they're all quite badly exposed to this as well.
Well, if we take a look at, certainly it's difficult to see within China itself, and certainly within these cities that have been quarantined, but this is quite an extreme measure to take. And the images that we do see of supermarket shelves being stripped bare, I mean, in terms of the local population, Einar Tangen, how exposed do you think small businessmen and smaller shops are to this? Because to quarantine an entire city seems like an extremely drastic measure, and that will likely have an impact on traders and on consumers who may be less able to weather such an economic storm.
Yeah, you're right. But remember, the quarantine is not for goods. It's really just for people. So the flow of goods continues. It's just that they have quarantine procedures so that basically the trucks go to the quarantine zone and then somebody else unloads and puts them onto another truck. So remember, China is building a hospital, 1,000-person hospital in 10 days. They have the logistics mastered. They've shown this in the past, and no one expects them to do anything less. I mean, the repeated phrase that I hear most often on the international press is, only China could do this. And I think that is true. I mean, for all the criticisms of how China governs itself, the fact is they're very efficient in terms of planning and execution. Now, in terms of this kind of the economic consequences, yes, it is early days, but because they're taking very draconian measures to contain the virus, that should shorten it. Remember, what we're trying to do is make sure that it doesn't spread throughout China so that you don't have to have an inoculation across the board. Keep in mind that this is a very tragic circumstances. It is affecting elderly and the young extremely a lot. But worldwide, last year, 650,000 people died because of influenza. So it is something that happens. There's a new strain that comes out every year. This year it was China, and before it has been other places. It is definitely a pandemic. It needs to be addressed critically, but it is not a situation which is beyond anything that we've known. It does not have the same kind of fatality, etc.
So would you say this is an
that
overreaction then,
thing
Einar
will
Tangen?
probably only last?
Is this an overreaction?
Well, I'm not saying it's an overreaction. No, I don't think so. I think what the government is saying to the people is we will watch out for it. Remember, because you have a one-party system, there's nowhere to hide. If the government were to callously say we don't care about a bunch of elderly people or young people, this would be viewed very dimly by the Chinese people. So they have to take stronger measures than perhaps would be available or even necessary in other places. You don't see this kind of reaction when you're looking in the US or EU. And I don't think, it's not even possible in places like India and Indonesia because of the healthcare situation and also the more limited powers of government.
Well, I mean, we'll come back to that in a second. I do want to widen out the discussion to look at the economic impacts around the region, because as we heard in Rob McBride's report, the action being taken in China is one thing, but China's neighbours are very, very concerned about how this could impact themselves. If I could come to you, Rajiv Biswas, do you think that China's neighbours are exposed to this economic impact, and what could they be doing to mitigate any economic impacts that may arise?
Well, certainly there's considerable risks of economic impact, and the most immediate concern in many countries in East Asia is because of tourism in China being now restricted severely. So outbound tourism has been clamped down on, and many countries have become more and more dependent on large flows of Chinese tourism. So the tourism economies of many countries like Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines are very concerned now that there's going to be a significant slowdown in Chinese tourism inflows, and that means a significant impact on overall tourism sector growth. It hurts the retail sales, it hurts hotels. Commercial aviation is also being impacted. And of course, if the Chinese economy does slow down significantly, even for a few months, as the consumer in China pulls back, they don't want to go to shops, they don't want to go to restaurants or entertainment, then that also hurts the neighboring countries, because China has become more and more important as an export market for many of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region. So all of these things are at the front of concerns of governments all around the region. They can take measures, fiscal and monetary stimulus measures are at the forefront of their toolkit that they could use. And I think there will be targeted measures rolled out quite soon in some of these countries like Thailand to help the tourism sector, the transport sectors, which are struggling in the coming weeks because of this shock.
Gareth Leather, if I could get your perspective on this. China's immediate neighbours in the region, we've heard there that tourism is a sector that will be impacted by this, by the lockdown of cities. Do you think that this constitutes a long-term impact, or is it perhaps a short-term blip that could self-correct?
I think the example of SARS showed that once the virus is under control and these restrictions are lifted, then economic activity will bounce back pretty quickly. But in the meantime, you do have an enormous economic hit to the rest of the region. So, as your previous guest mentioned, tourism's the main way that these economies are going to be impacted. But it's not just international tourists, it's domestic tourists as well, that if people are worried about being infected, they're not going to go to the shops, they're not going to go to the cinema, they're not going to go and eat out. There's also a concern as well that this could spread to the industrial sector. So, for example, in China, they've extended the Chinese New Year holiday by 3 days. Shanghai, for example, has told companies to close down for an extra 2 weeks. That's going to have quite severe knock-on effects for regional supply chains as well. So the impact is not just through tourism, but I think it will bounce back very quickly if and when the virus does get under control.
The elephant in the room, of course, is that there is a certain amount of exposure when it comes to China's immediate neighbours, but China's the economic pressure it's feeling comes from the United States. China and the US are in the midst of a trade war. Gareth Leather, how do you think this plays into the economic risks that China's facing?
Well, I think it's just another headwind for the Chinese economy. I think, though, the impact of this virus, it should hopefully prove short-lived, whereas the trade war and the decoupling that's going on from the US economy is more of a long-run factor that will continue and probably outlast this virus. But I think at the moment the virus is very much taking precedence over worries about the trade war.
Einar Tangen, could I get your thoughts on this? How do you think the US-China trade war is perhaps impacting China's economic concerns when it comes to tackling the let's call these the secondary impacts of this viral outbreak? Do you think that's playing on the minds of the Chinese political leadership?
I'm going to agree with my colleague and say that they're a little bit different. I would point out one thing, that because they've quarantined basically 60 million people and growing, what this means is a lot of people will not be able to return to those factories for a number of weeks or even more than a month. So that will impact production. But if we look at the only thing that we can really study, which was the SARS outbreak, it's fairly clear that things do tend to bounce back. Now, at that time, you were facing an growing economy, especially in China. There's a lot of global activity. These days, it looks like that things are slowing a little bit. So yes, while the U.S.-China situation is not good, it's really the overall momentum of the world economy that's going to be things. The question is, a lot of people have had is, would this be a trigger to a recession? I think it's relatively small. Even a 1% decrease in Chinese GDP in terms of how that affects the U.S. and the world is very, very minimal. 0.003 for the world and 0.02 for the U.S. and Europe. So we're not talking about large boxcar numbers, even though China provides the majority of over 30% of the world's growth. I think it is something they handle. I think people have to to kind of step back, look at what happened in 2003, and then make better estimations rather than reacting out of fear or saying we don't know.
Well, quite, but it is a very different economy, the Chinese economy in 2003 and the Chinese economy now. And certainly, if you look at it in terms of, China's GDP at the time compared to China's GDP now, and how that relates to the overall metrics, these are two very, very different beasts. Einar Tangen.
Absolutely, and there will be, and I agree with Rajiv. This will be something, especially as it goes to choice items. When you're talking about tourism, hotels, airline travel, entertainment, theaters are going to be empty. Restaurants are going to have a hard time. But let's look at the other side. Online sales and delivery is going to explode. People are going to say, I'm not going to go to the store, so I'll order things in. So China is uniquely positioned in that regard because they have a fully developed system for doing that and dealing with it. So those are the areas, if you're looking for the winners, in addition to anyone who can make a viral antidote and to face masks and things like that, it's going to be those people who can provide things online to people who don't want to go out and clear the shelves of their local 7-Eleven. They would prefer to have exactly what they want delivered to their door.
Okay. Rajiv Biswas, how do you say this affects the global economy? Do you think there is a risk that the economic effects that we're seeing with this virus, do you think that could tip the global economy into a recession?
I think it's too early to have that kind of scenario because I think, we're only into the first few weeks. And a lot will depend on how quickly this can be contained by the health authorities in China, and also whether the virus spreads in a significant way to other countries, which is also an unknown factor right now. So a downside risk scenario would be if we do see a continued escalation in the epidemic within China, that it spreads to other major cities and provinces, and also if it spreads to other countries, because so far the main impact in terms of actual cases has been relatively limited to a certain part of China and hasn't really spread globally, but we don't know yet whether it could. I think that's a very important risk, because if that happens, then a key mechanism which could hurt the global economy is consumer sentiment.
Okay.
In China, I think that's a major risk, that consumer sentiment could weaken considerably across the country, which hurts consumer spending. And this fear factor could also affect other countries that are having significant numbers of cases. Singapore, Thailand, South Korea, are countries where we've seen a number of cases already.
Quite. We're in the dying minutes of this debate. So if I could come to you, Gareth Leather, and just say, how would you rate the Chinese response? We get the impression it's too early to tell in terms of the potential impacts of this virus. But in terms of China's response to the crisis, how would you rate that?
Well, I think they were initially, people were quite critical because they weren't very open initially. But since, I think, the beginning of last week, they've been much more open, much more proactive as well in trying to clamp down on this virus. And while some of the steps that you've seen, such as closing off entire cities, might seem quite drastic, they should hopefully in time help stop the spread of the virus. And I think places like such as the WHO have been quite have been praising China's response so far.
Okay, I know Tangen. We talked about the lessons that China has learned from the SARS epidemic. What lessons do you think China will take away from this?
Well, this is a good example of where AI and all these sensors, and eventually where 5G will fit in, the ability to model on real time what is actually happening is absolutely essential to a critical response. And I think this China will provide a case study for other nations of what is possible with this kind of enhanced three-part system of sensors where you can get the information, you can transmit it by 5G, and then you can crunch the numbers and try to create solutions using the artificial intelligence.
And Rajiv Biswas, to you, in terms of the response, how would you rate it, and what lessons do you think the rest of the world can take from the Chinese response to this?
Well, I think we need to recognize we're still in an escalating phase of this epidemic. And I think it's critical that other governments around the world, and particularly in the Asia Pacific, are extremely robust in their actions. And we're seeing countries like Singapore taking quite significant measures. I think all governments need to really be at the forefront of response to try to contain this epidemic and to do all possible things to try to contain it. And of course, I think China has made huge efforts now, and very responsible measures like stopping tourism outflows from China to try to help the rest of the world. So I think China, the Chinese government, is doing all it can, and it's putting huge resources into this. But you're dealing with an epidemic, and it's very unpredictable how it's going to escalate. So I think all governments cannot be complacent anymore in any way about this, and have to be taking all possible measures to contain it, to prevent a more serious impact on the economy. Even if it's only for a few months, it could be quite a disruption to the economies of many countries in the Asia Pacific.
Okay, and with that, we'll have to draw this discussion to a close. But thank you very much indeed, all of my guests, Einar Tangen, Rajiv Biswas and Gareth Leather. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just head to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And the conversation continues online on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or tweet me directly @Halima Hideen. For me and the whole team here, it's bye for now.